When we think of a machine, we generally expect it to do like one specific thing with absolute precision.
Right. Yeah, exactly. A single repeatable function.
Right. Like a toaster toast bread. A car drives you from point A to point B.
Sure.
And if you put a slice of bread into your kitchen toaster and it somehow, I don't know, freezes the bread solid, you don't keep it around to see what happens next. You just throw the toaster away.
Because it's fundamentally broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the function of the machine is its entire identity.
It's totally binary. The machine either executes its designed purpose or it's obsolete.
Right. But then you look at the United Nations, and suddenly that simple binary machine metaphor just completely falls apart.
Oh, absolutely.
Because depending on the day, or the specific push notification you happen to be reading on your phone, this global machine looks like a hopelessly broken toaster.
It really does.
You see a news alert about a Security Council veto completely paralyzing global action during this massive, devastating geopolitical crisis. And the immediate human instinct is to say, throw it out. The whole thing is utterly useless.
Which is a completely understandable reaction, honestly.
Yeah.
When you view the institution exclusively through the lens of high-stakes political gridlock, cynicism is the most logical response.
But on that exact same day, while the politicians are totally gridlocked in New York, that exact same machine is delivering thousands of tons of grain to a famine-struck war zone.
Right.
It's coordinating the hyper-complex flight paths of thousands of commercial airplanes so they don't crash into each other over the Atlantic.
It's running vaccination campaigns to eradicate polio in remote villages.
Yes. So welcome to today's deep dive. I am looking right at you, the learner. We know you're here because you demand to understand the mechanics beneath the headlines.
The real gears turning behind the scenes.
Yeah. Exactly. Whether you're prepping for a massive strategy meeting or catching up on the realities of international relations, or you're just insanely curious about how the world actually runs.
Which is a great reason to be here.
Understanding the architecture of the United Nations is your ultimate shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Because it is, without exaggeration, the underlying operating system of the globe.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission today is to look under the hood of this massive, paradoxical piece of global software.
And we have some incredible source material to help us do that.
We do. We're drawing from an exhaustive, intensely detailed new report on the UN's history, its sprawling structural anatomy, and the modern polycrises actively threatening to tear it apart.
It's a heavy read, but a crucial one.
We want to figure out how this machine works, why it fails, and why we haven't thrown it away. Because the first thing we need to understand, the learner, is that the UN is almost certainly not what you think it is.
No, not at all. What's fascinating here is the sheer dichotomy of the United Nations. We really have to establish a foundational analytical framework right at the top.
Okay, set the baseline for us.
The UN is not a nascent world government. It just isn't. It doesn't possess a standing army sitting in a barracks waiting for orders.
Right, there's no UN military base somewhere.
Exactly. It has no authority to levy taxes on global citizens either. Fundamentally, it's a mirror.
A mirror. I like that.
It's a reflection of the geopolitical realities and the raw power dynamics of its member states.
So it's only as good or as bad as the countries that make it up.
Precisely. It exists as a paralyzed political forum where great power rivalries play out in real time while simultaneously serving as the absolute, indispensable distributor of global humanitarian survival.
It's like the server where the world's software, things like international law, human rights standards, global development goals, is constantly being coded and recoded.
That's a great way to look at it.
But to understand why that software is currently so incredibly buggy and why the system constantly seems to freeze up, we can't just look at the code today.
No, you have to go back to the source.
We actually have to perform an autopsy on its predecessor. We have to go back a century to look at a blueprint of absolute failure, which is the League of Nations.
Oh, the League. Yeah, if you want to understand the DNA of the UN Charter drafted in 1945, you are legally required to look at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
Right, coming right out of the horrors of World War I.
Exactly. The League of Nations was born from that mechanized slaughter. It was heavily driven by the lofty idealism of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson.
Which sounded great on paper.
Conceptually, it was revolutionary. It was the first global intergovernmental organization explicitly dedicated to maintaining world peace through collective security, but it was born with fatal congenital flaws.
Flaw number one being that the chief architect's own country didn't even bother to show up to the ribbon-cutting ceremony.
The ultimate historical irony. The United States Senate, which was heavily gripped by isolationism at the time, just outright rejected the Treaty of Versailles and flatly refused to join the League.
So right out of the gate, you have an allegedly universal organization that is entirely missing the economic and military weight of the world's rapidly rising superpower.
It was doomed from the start. But the membership hemorrhage didn't stop there.
Right? Other big players bailed too.
The Soviet Union was excluded until 1934, only to be expelled a few years later in 1939 after they invaded Finland.
Germany withdrew as well, right?
Yes, Germany withdrew in 1933 when Hitler came to power. Japan and Italy followed suit shortly after.
Wow.
A global body attempting to dictate world events without the principal power brokers of its era sitting at the table is completely destined for irrelevance.
I want to push back on that a bit, though.
Okay, go for it.
Because I don't think it was just about who abandoned the room. I mean, even if everyone had stayed, the rules for the people who were in the room were practically designed to ensure nothing ever got done.
You're talking about the procedural rules.
Yeah, the League was completely hamstrung by this mechanism called the unanimity rule.
Yes, the unanimity rule. The League Council required unanimous 100% agreement for any substantive action to be taken.
Which is wild.
In practice, this effectively handed every single member state an absolute veto over collective action.
Think about how insane that is in practice. The learner. I want you to imagine a group chat on your phone with 50 different people in it.
Sounds like a nightmare already.
Right. And the absolute rule of this group chat is that every single person has to perfectly agree on a specific restaurant before anyone is allowed to order food. What is the inevitable result?
Complete paralysis.
Yeah.
Nobody eats.
Exactly. Resulting in global starvation. I mean, one person demands pizza, one person wants sushi, 3 people aren't checking their phones, and the whole night is ruined.
That's a perfect analogy.
In the League's case, an aggressive state could just block collective action against itself, or simply walk out of the room, and there was no enforcement mechanism.
None. There was no military arm whatsoever.
So what do they actually do?
The League had to rely on members to voluntarily enforce economic sanctions, which countries like Britain and France were completely unwilling to do during the devastating economic reality of the Great Depression.
Which is exactly why the League failed its most critical tests.
Catastrophically. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League sent a commission, wrote a strongly worded report condemning the action, and Japan just simply left the League.
Just packed up and left.
Yeah. And when Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, literally using chemical weapons against civilians, the League imposed incredibly weak sanctions that entirely avoided crucial resources like oil.
So they just watched.
The League just watched. It was the death knell of the institution.
And this autopsy directly brings us to the fires of World War II and the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yes, a very different kind of leader than Wilson.
Very different. The blueprint for the United Nations wasn't drafted in some peaceful utopian summit in a sunny meadow. It was literally drafted while entire continents were burning.
It was born out of absolute desperation.
Right. Roosevelt looked at the ashes of Wilson's League and engaged in a level of geopolitical realism that Wilson had completely shunned.
Roosevelt knew he needed 2 things to make a new body work. First, airtight bipartisan domestic support in the U.S.
So the Senate wouldn't bail again.
Exactly. And second, the active, committed participation of the Soviet Union.
That is the vital context. The first official use of the term United Nations wasn't about peace at all, was it?
No, not at all. It was the 1942 Declaration by United Nations.
This was a military alliance?
Yes, it was a formal pledge by 26 nations to use their absolute full military and economic resources against the Axis powers, and a promise not to make a separate peace.
So it was, at its genesis, a wartime military alliance against fascism.
Exactly.
So Roosevelt comes up with this concept to solve the 50-person group chat problem that killed the League. He calls it the 4 policemen.
Right. The U.S., Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China.
In our restaurant analogy, these 4 guys get to pick the menu.
They have the power.
They have the guns, they enforce the peace, and all the smaller nations get to make up an assembly to voice their opinions. This early concept is the direct seed of the modern Security Council.
It is. The actual gestation of the charter happened through a series of massive high-stakes wartime conferences.
Like the Atlantic Charter.
Right, the Atlantic Charter in 1941, setting the ideological goals. Dumbarton Oaks in 1944, where diplomats hammered out the technical proposals.
And then the big one.
And then the absolute critical turning point. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Yalta is the room where the veto was formally conceded.
Okay, let me stop you there because I want to challenge this.
Sure.
This is such a crucial point for the learner because the veto is universally despised today. You read op-eds every week saying it's undemocratic, it's unfair, it's a relic.
That's the common sentiment, yeah.
So doesn't designing a system where 5 specific countries are permanently above international law make the whole institution fundamentally hypocritical from day one?
You can certainly argue it's morally hypocritical. But from an architectural standpoint, the veto was the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for the UN's existence.
Really? Non-negotiable.
Absolutely. The Soviet Union, deeply suspicious of the West, demanded an absolute veto to prevent a Western-dominated majority from ever using the organization's military apparatus against Soviet interests.
That makes sense from their perspective.
If Roosevelt and Churchill hadn't agreed to the veto power for the permanent members, Stalin simply would not have joined, period.
Wow.
And without the Soviet Union, you don't have a global body. You just have a Western military alliance, and you repeat the exact failure of the League of Nations.
Because if the UN tried to enforce a majority vote resolution against a nuclear-armed superpower, say, ordering the Soviet Union to withdraw from a territory, it wouldn't result in that superpower saying, oh, darn, we lost the vote, we'll pack up and go home.
No, it would result in World War III.
Exactly. So the veto is not a bug. It's pure, unadulterated realism.
Precisely. It was designed to ensure that the UN would never mandate an action that would force the great powers into a direct military confrontation with one another.
Okay, so that brings us to 1945 at the San Francisco conference. 50 nations gathered to finalize the charter.
And the guest list tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, you were only invited to San Francisco if your nation had formally declared war on the Axis by March 1945.
The UN was, at its very birth, a victors' club.
A victors' club that nonetheless managed to save some of the best furniture from the burning house of the League of Nations. Because the League didn't just vanish into thin air.
No, the transition in 1946 was fascinating. The League formally dissolved, but it transferred its physical assets and its technical mandates to the new United Nations.
Crucial functional work regarding global health, refugees, and labor standards.
Exactly. The political architecture of the League was a complete disaster, but its functional approach to international cooperation was brilliant, and that functional DNA was saved.
Which perfectly sets up how the DNA of a 1940s wartime alliance continues to absolutely dictate the power dynamics of the 2020s.
We're still living in that framework.
We are actively anchoring global security right now to a snapshot of who had the biggest guns and the most leverage in 1945.
It's a snapshot frozen in time.
And to manage that incredible tension between the democratic ideals of the global majority and the great power realism of the victors, they had to build an incredibly complex structural anatomy.
Which brings us to Section 2, the actual machine itself.
Let's get into it.
Because of this desperate need to balance competing realities, the UN's structural anatomy is intentionally heavily decentralized. It's split into different organs with vastly different powers and, crucially, different funding models.
So the 1945 Charter established 6 principal organs. But let's not just list these out like a textbook.
Right.
If I'm a listener and I know there's no world president, how do 193 incredibly different countries actually make a decision? Like, is there a global parliament?
The closest thing to a global parliament is the General Assembly, or the GA. This is the town hall of the world.
Okay.
It currently has 193 member states, and it operates on the strict principle of sovereign equality. One state gets one vote.
So the economic powerhouse of the United States has exactly one vote, and the tiny Pacific island nation of Tuvalu has exactly one vote.
Correct. But the catch is that GA resolutions are generally non-binding.
Ah, right. So they carry massive moral weight, they signal global opinion, but they're not a legal mandate that forces a country to change its laws or its borders.
Exactly. For the actual legal teeth, you turn to the second organ, the Security Council.
The enforcer.
The Security Council is the enforcer. It's a tiny room compared to the GA. Only 15 members total. 10 of those are elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms.
But the real unyielding power lies with the P5.
Yes, the 5 permanent members. China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. They hold that absolute veto power.
And their decisions actually matter legally, right?
The Security Council is the only UN body whose decisions are legally binding on all member states under international law. They can impose crippling economic sanctions, authorize the use of international military force, and establish peacekeeping missions.
Okay, so that's the GA and the Security Council. Then you have the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, which acts as the central coordinator for global development and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
You have the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, or the World Court in The Hague, which exists to settle legal disputes between states, although its jurisdiction usually requires the consent of the states involved.
Then there is the Secretariat. This is the massive civil service of the UN.
The people actually doing the paperwork.
Tens of thousands of international staff members deployed globally, led by the Secretary General.
And the Secretary General has what our source material accurately describes as the most impossible job in the world.
Truly impossible. They are tasked with acting as the independent, moral voice of the UN Charter, while simultaneously having to maintain the constant trust and favor of the P5.
Because any single permanent member can veto their reappointment.
Exactly. It's a constant balancing act.
And finally, there's the sixth organ, which I find oddly hilarious because it's so rare in government, the Trusteeship Council. It's an organ that literally put itself out of business.
It is a phenomenal anomaly. It was originally set up to supervise the transition of trust territories, mostly former colonies from the League of Nations era, to full independence and self-government.
And they actually finished the job.
In 1994, the Pacific nation of Palau, the last remaining trust territory, became independent. Having successfully completed its exact mandate, the council suspended its operations.
But because formally abolishing it would require opening up the UN Charter for amendments, which opens a Pandora's box of political demands from every nation, they just leave it alone.
Yeah, it just sits there on paper, totally inactive.
Now, the learner, here's where it gets really interesting. This is the structural secret that completely changed how I read the news.
It's a huge distinction.
We hear the phrase the UN constantly. We hear about all these acronyms, WHO, UNICEF, WFP, IMF. We group them all together as one big monolith.
But the source material makes an incredibly critical distinction between the UN proper and the UN system, which they call the family.
If you take nothing else away from this structural breakdown, grasp this concept.
Yes. The sprawling UN system is divided broadly into two entirely different categories of organizations, funds and programs on one side, and specialized agencies on the other.
Let's break down funds and programs first. This includes household names, UNDP for development, UNICEF for children, the World Food Program, the UNHCR for refugees.
These entities are technically subordinate parts of the UN organization proper. They report directly to the General Assembly.
But here is the critical defining mechanical detail. They rely almost entirely on voluntary contributions from governments, corporations, and private donors.
Meaning they don't have a guaranteed tax base.
So they're essentially living paycheck to paycheck.
Highly vulnerable to the political whims of massive donor countries. They're designed to be highly responsive to sudden global emergencies, like an earthquake or a sudden refugee crisis. But structurally, they are incredibly fragile.
So if a major donor country gets angry about a specific policy or a geopolitical stance and decides to freeze their voluntary funding, what happens?
A fund's entire operational capacity in a region can face immediate catastrophic collapse.
That's terrifying. But then on the other side of the family tree, you have the specialized agencies. This includes the World Health Organization, the IMF, UNESCO, the Food and Agriculture Organization.
These are not subordinate bodies. These are legally autonomous cousins to the UN.
Cousins, okay.
They were founded by their own entirely separate international treaties. They have their own governing assemblies, their own elected executive heads, and entirely separate budgets.
And most importantly, their core funding relies on assessed dues, mandatory membership fees from the countries that sign their treaties, supplemented by additional voluntary funds. Wait, I really want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this.
Sure.
So when a politician gets on a podium during an election year and angrily threatens to defund the UN because they're furious about a General Assembly vote in New York, they can't actually touch the WHO's core budget overnight without formally withdrawing their entire country from a completely separate international treaty.
That is exactly how the mechanism works.
It's not just one big shared bank account.
No, not at all. They are financially and legally firewalled from the political organs in New York to a very significant degree.
Wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this completely explains why the UN can seem entirely broken and gridlocked on your television screen, yet highly effective and operational on the ground.
Give us an example of that.
A brilliant example detailed in the source is ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization.
Right. ICAO sets the baseline technical standards for global air travel safety.
And they are a legally autonomous specialized agency based in Montreal.
So they're completely separate from the New York drama.
Exactly. Even when the political UN in New York is completely paralyzed by a bitter Security Council veto over war, the technical UN in Montreal, ICAO, is functioning perfectly, seamlessly regulating the safety protocols, air traffic control standards, and runway regulations for your next international flight.
So the learner, the next time you hear a cable news debate screaming about UN funding, you now have the insider knowledge to ask the actual structural question. Wait, are we talking about a voluntary fund like UNICEF or an assessed specialized agency like the WHO?
It completely changes the reality of the conversation.
It fundamentally changes everything about the vulnerability, the longevity, and the political independence of those specific institutions.
It really does.
Okay, so we've talked about how the Security Council is theoretically supposed to enforce global peace. But theory is easy. How did that actually work mechanically when boots hit the mud?
That's the messy part.
Let's move to Section 3 and look at the UN's most famous, yet surprisingly unwritten, invention. The Blue Helmets. UN peacekeeping.
It is a remarkable historical improvisation because the word peacekeeping is literally nowhere to be found in the UN Charter.
Nowhere.
Nowhere. Dag Hammarskjöld, the legendary Second Secretary General, famously quipped that peacekeeping belongs to Chapter 6.5 of the Charter.
What does that mean structurally, Chapter 6.5?
Well, the Charter has Chapter 6, which covers the peaceful diplomatic resolution of disputes like mediation and negotiation.
Okay.
Then it jumps to Chapter 7, which authorizes hard military enforcement and the use of force.
Like actual warfare.
Right. Peacekeeping evolved organically as a pragmatic gray area right in between them. It's military personnel deployed, but not to wage war.
And it operates, or at least traditional peacekeeping as it was originally conceived, operates on what the source material calls the Holy Trinity of principles.
Yes, the three foundational pillars. First, consent of the parties. Peacekeepers only deploy if the warring factions, the government and the rebels, or two warring states, actually agree to sign a ceasefire and invite the Blue Helmets in.
So they have to be invited.
Second, impartiality. Peacekeepers do not pick a good guy and a bad guy. They are there to strictly referee the peace agreement.
Like umpires.
And third, the non-use of force, except in strict self-defense or defense of the specific mandate.
Now, during the Cold War, this mechanism was pretty constrained because the U.S. and the Soviets were vetoing almost everything.
Right, it was practically frozen.
But in the 1990s, right after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this massive, almost intoxicating global euphoria. The source calls it the Sleeping Beauty era.
I love that term.
The idea that the UN had just been frozen in ice during the Cold War and was finally waking up to do the job it was designed for in 1945.
The floodgates opened. The Security Council, finally freed from the constant threat of the Soviet veto, started authorizing complex, multidimensional deployments left and right.
And did they work?
I want to emphasize something contrary to a lot of popular, cynical narratives. The empirical data strongly shows that peacekeeping generally works. Comprehensive studies indicate that the presence of UN peacekeepers significantly reduces civilian casualties, shortens the duration of conflicts, and drastically lowers the risk of civil wars reigniting. 2/3 of post-Cold War missions successfully implemented their mandates and withdrew.
The source gives some incredible examples of these quiet, massive successes that rarely make the front page because peace maintained doesn't generate clicks.
It's not flashy news.
Look at Sierra Leone. After a horrifically brutal, decade-long civil war, famous for its atrocities, the UN deployed a massive mission. They didn't just stand around.
No, they actively disarmed tens of thousands of ex-combatants.
They helped rebuild the police force, restored democratic governance, and even helped establish a special court to try war criminals.
It was a massive success.
Or look at Timor-Leste, where the UN basically had to administer a brand new nation from scratch. They built a civil service, trained judges, and managed the country while it transitioned to full independence.
Cambodia in the early 90s is another massive logistical triumph.
But we have to acknowledge that the immense optimism of that 1990s Sleeping Beauty era was absolutely shattered by some of the most catastrophic, agonizing failures in the organization's history.
Failures that haunt the corridors of the UN to this very day and fundamentally forced a shift in their military doctrine.
We have to talk about the absolute nightmare of Rwanda in 1994.
Yes. In Rwanda, you had a small UN peacekeeping force, UNAMIR, under the command of Canadian General Romeo Dallaire.
He saw it coming, right?
As the political situation rapidly deteriorated, Dallaire sent frantic cables to New York warning of an impending genocide, begging for reinforcements and the authority to raid weapons caches.
But the force lacked a robust mandate.
And tragically, the Security Council, largely driven by intense U.S. reluctance to get involved in another African conflict after the Black Hawk Down disaster in Somalia the previous year, actively refused to reinforce the mission.
They just said no.
Instead, they initially voted to draw the force down.
So the peacekeepers were ordered to essentially stand by, while over 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were systematically slaughtered with machetes in 100 days.
They effectively abandoned the civilian population. It remains the UN's greatest, most searing moral failure.
And then, just a year later, Srebrenica in 1995. The UN Security Council formally declares the town a safe area, ostensibly protected by a lightly armed battalion of Dutch peacekeepers.
Right.
But when heavily armed Bosnian Serb forces advance on the town, the peacekeepers are completely outgunned and surrounded. They call for NATO air support, which is delayed and ineffective.
It was a complete collapse of support.
Ultimately, the peacekeepers surrender the town without firing a shot, and Bosnian Serb forces systematically massacre over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys.
These twin traumas completely altered the trajectory of the UN. The utter failure of traditional impartiality in the face of genocide forced a massive doctrinal shift toward the protection of civilians, or POC, as the central overriding mandate of new missions.
So the rules changed.
This led to what we now call robust peacekeeping, where troops deployed to places like the Congo are sometimes specifically authorized to use all necessary military means offensive force to actively neutralize armed rebel groups that threaten civilians.
I can play devil's advocate here, because this highlights the ultimate paradox of peacekeeping.
Okay.
The UN takes 100% of the public blame when these missions fail. But Rwanda and Srebrenica mechanically proved that the UN is only as strong as the political will of its member states.
Exactly.
The UN does not have its own army. When a crisis breaks out, the Secretary General literally has to beg individual countries to volunteer troops, to lend helicopters, to write checks.
They have to go hat in hand.
If the member states aren't willing to risk the blood of their own soldiers and the treasure of their own taxpayers for strangers in a faraway conflict, the mission is doomed to fail. The UN is a vessel. It is not an independent actor.
That is a crucial, vital distinction. The UN is merely the framework. And that absolute reliance on member states, and crucially, on the consent of the host states where the conflicts are happening, has led directly to the massive crisis of peacekeeping we are seeing right now in 2024 and 2025.
A crisis of consent.
It is a fundamental crisis of consent.
Walk me through that. What does a crisis of consent look like on the ground today?
We are witnessing a rapid retreat. The global appetite for large, multidimensional, decades-long peacekeeping missions is collapsing.
Where are we seeing this?
Major, deeply embedded missions in Mali and Sudan were recently forced to close down abruptly and chaotically.
Why?
Because the host governments, often military juntas that took power via coups, became utterly hostile to the UN's presence and simply ordered them to pack up and leave.
Just kicked them out.
We are seeing massive political tensions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Lebanon, where the UNIFIL force is currently caught in the horrific crossfire of active, heavy hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah.
But if a country is deeply unstable, why would a fragile host government actively kick out an international force that is there to help maintain security?
Because those host governments are increasingly turning to a very different kind of bilateral security arrangement. Specifically, they are hiring private military companies.
Mercenaries.
Mercenary groups, most notably the Russian state-backed Wagner Group, now rebranded as the Afrika Korps.
So they are trading blue helmets for mercenaries. What is the mechanical advantage of that for a dictator?
It is entirely transactional. Mercenaries fight without the strict human rights scrutiny the mandatory public reporting mechanisms, and the international legal accountability that come permanently attached to UN Blue Helmets.
So there's no oversight.
None. A mercenary group will help a junta ruthlessly crush a rebellion and secure gold mines without ever publishing a report on civilian casualties. It is a darker, purely transactional approach to state security that completely bypasses the UN framework.
This is deeply sobering. And this crisis of consent in peacekeeping, this fracturing of international norms, is really just a symptom of a much larger disease infecting the UN right now.
The return of great power rivalry.
Exactly. What some analysts in the source are explicitly calling Cold War II, which is actively paralyzing the Security Council as we speak.
It's gridlock all over again.
Which brings us to Section 4, the contemporary stress test. We've looked at the machinery. Now we are going to look at how this structural machinery handles two of the most acute, devastating, and globally polarizing conflicts of our time, Ukraine and Gaza.
Right.
Now, I want to take a pause here. Before we dive into this section, I want to speak directly to you, the learner. We are about to look at two incredibly politically charged, deeply painful, ongoing conflicts.
Emotions and stakes are unimaginably high.
Our explicit mission in this deep dive is strictly to examine the structural mechanics and the specific organizational reports detailed in our source material. We are doing this impartially.
Very important to state.
We are not taking sides. We are not assigning moral blame. And we are not endorsing any political viewpoints from the left or the right. We are simply putting the UN's architecture under a microscope to see how its gears grind when subjected to these specific, immense geopolitical pressures.
That is a vital framework to maintain. Let's look at the war in Ukraine, which violently escalated with the full-scale invasion in 2022.
Okay.
From a purely structural UN perspective, this presented a direct existential challenge to the core premise of the UN Charter itself. You had a permanent member of the Security Council, the Russian Federation, invading a sovereign neighbor in a war of territorial conquest.
And because Russia holds one of those 5 permanent seats, they simply deployed their veto.
Precisely. They legally utilized the veto mechanism to block any Security Council resolution condemning the invasion, demanding a cessation of hostilities, or mandating a withdrawal.
So the enforcer was totally stopped.
Yeah. This action completely deadlocked the primary organ of global security. For many global observers, it powerfully reinforced the public perception that the Security Council is fundamentally unfit for purpose when one of the great powers themselves is the aggressor.
But earlier, we established that the UN isn't just the Security Council. Remember the General Assembly, the town hall where everyone gets one vote. The source notes that the broader UN found a fascinating structural workaround to the P5 deadlock.
Yes, they did. When the Security Council is paralyzed, the General Assembly can activate a mechanism known as the Uniting for Peace Resolution, or Resolution 377A.
Where did that come from?
This was actually created during the Korean War. It allows the General Assembly to take up matters of international peace and security if the Security Council fails to exercise its primary responsibility due to a lack of unanimity among the P5.
So they basically bypassed the council.
Using this mechanism, the General Assembly convened and voted overwhelmingly, with 141 member states in favor, to formally condemn the aggression and demand a withdrawal.
But let me interrupt, because we already established the rules. GA votes are non-binding.
Right.
A resolution in the General Assembly cannot physically force a tank column to turn around and go home. It doesn't trigger military force.
Yeah.
So, mechanically, what is the actual point of doing it?
The point is the formalization of massive diplomatic isolation. It demonstrates to the world, formally, legally, and permanently on the historical record, that the aggressor entirely lacks international legitimacy according to the global majority.
It's a statement of global norms.
It is a powerful weaponization of global norms. And crucially, while the political arm in New York is deadlocked, the massive humanitarian arms agencies like UNHCR and the World Food Program continue to function at full capacity, deploying thousands of staff to coordinate shelter, food, and logistics for millions of displaced Ukrainian civilians.
It is the ultimate display of the split personality of the UN in action. The political brain is paralyzed by a veto, but the humanitarian hands are in overdrive.
Exactly.
Which leads us to the crisis in Gaza, which tests a completely different part of the UN's structural anatomy. It tests the absolute limits of the voluntary funding mechanism we talked about earlier, specifically focusing on an agency called UNRWA.
UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. To understand the profound complexity of the Gaza crisis from a UN perspective, you have to understand the highly unique, historically embedded mandate of UNRWA.
Right, because UNRWA is not the UNHCR. UNHCR deals with all other refugee crises globally, and their ultimate goal is usually to resettle refugees or integrate them into host countries.
UNRWA operates on a totally different set of rules. UNRWA was created in 1949 specifically and exclusively for Palestinian refugees following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, pending a just resolution to the conflict.
So it's not just handing out tents.
No, it acts essentially as a massive quasi-state municipal provider.
When you say quasi-state, give the learner a sense of the actual scale of this operation. What does UNRWA actually do on a random Tuesday morning in Gaza?
The scale is staggering. Before the recent escalation, UNRWA employed over 30,000 staff members across the region, the vast majority being Palestinian refugees themselves.
30,000 staff members.
In Gaza alone, they directly run and manage over 700 schools, educating hundreds of thousands of children. They operate primary healthcare clinics, administer vaccines, distribute flour, and physically manage municipal services like garbage collection and water pumping in the camps.
So it is a massive, deeply embedded, irreplaceable civic infrastructure.
Yes. And following the horrific October 7 attacks by Hamas, devastating allegations surfaced regarding the alleged involvement of some UNRWA staff members in the violence.
And because of UNRWA's specific structural classification, remembering our earlier discussion, UNRWA is a UN fund, meaning it relies almost entirely on voluntary contributions from donor nations. The financial reaction was immediate.
Immediate and catastrophic to its operations. Major global donors, led by the United States, immediately suspended their voluntary funding pending investigations.
Which means they can't pay their bills.
This precipitated a severe existential liquidity crisis for the entire agency, threatening to halt all operations within weeks.
But the source material highlights a brutal, inescapable logistical reality on the ground in Gaza amidst the ongoing bombardment. Despite the immense political controversy in the investigations, the UN's firm structural argument is that UNRWA is the only entity on the planet with the physical networks, the warehouses, the trucks, and the embedded logistical personnel capable of actually delivering humanitarian aid at scale to the population in Gaza.
You cannot simply build a replacement for a 30,000-person organization with 700 facilities overnight.
You just can't.
That is the core of the operational dilemma. In response to the crisis, an independent review group was commissioned, led by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, alongside internal UN oversight audits throughout 2024.
What does he find?
The Colonna report concluded by recommending dozens of stringent, tightening measures regarding neutrality reforms, staff vetting, and educational material oversight. The institutional position of the UN, as outlined in the reports, is that while individual staff members may have violated the core principle of neutrality, the agency itself remains the absolute, indispensable backbone for civilian survival in the territory.
If we zoom out and connect this back to the big picture of the UN's architectural structure, what do these two massive crises, Ukraine and Gaza, tell us about the absolute limits of the system?
They perfectly, tragically illustrate the ultimate boundaries of the machine. In Ukraine, we see the absolute ceiling of the Security Council. The enforcement mechanism cannot and will not function when a nuclear P5 member is directly involved in a conflict.
Just stops.
And in Gaza, we see the absolute vulnerability of the humanitarian arm. We see how rapidly operations can collapse when a voluntary funded agency has its political neutrality questioned and donor funding is instantly weaponized.
Which honestly makes me think about the Secretariat, the Secretary General. The source called it the most impossible job. And looking at Ukraine and Gaza, you can vividly see why.
Oh, absolutely.
Mechanically, how does one person navigate this? The SG has to remain neutral and maintain open diplomatic channels with everyone just to negotiate getting aid trucks across a border.
Right.
But simultaneously, they are mandated by the Charter to publicly call out gross violations of international law. If they speak out too forcefully, they enrage and alienate the exact same powerful member states who hold the veto power and who write the voluntary checks that keep the aid trucks running in the first place.
It is a terrifying tightrope. It is diplomatic agony. Every statement is scrutinized. Every action is weighed against the potential loss of humanitarian funding.
It's just incredible pressure.
And keep in mind, the learner, while the political organs in New York are entirely consumed by these acute, explosive, headline-dominating wars, the broader UN system is simultaneously tasked with managing massive, slow-moving transnational threats.
Existential threats to the future of human civilization.
And they are trying to manage them with an empty wallet.
Yes, the polycrisis. Let's transition to Section 5. We've just seen how these explosive, acute conflicts consume all the political oxygen and billions of dollars in military funding.
Right.
But the tragic irony is that while the Security Council is fiercely arguing over borders and ceasefires, the actual slow-moving existential threats to human survival are quietly being starved of capital and attention.
It's a massive blind spot.
Let's look at these slow-moving threats, starting with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the UN's grand, highly publicized 17-point blueprint for a better world by 2030 goals like ending extreme poverty, zero hunger, clean water, and climate action.
The 2024 comprehensive report on these goals is frankly an incredibly grim read.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
It's a sobering assessment of global progress. According to the hard data in the report, only 16 to 17% of the SDG targets are currently on track to be met by the 2030 deadline.
Wow, under 20%.
Nearly half of the targets show minimal or moderate progress, and tragically, over a third have actually completely stalled or actively regressed entirely below their 2015 baselines.
The regressions are what genuinely stunned me in the source material. Global hunger is up by 100 million people since 2019. And the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with subsequent economic shocks, wiped out a full decade of hard-fought gains in global life expectancy.
An entire decade of human progress erased.
So what's the plan to fix it?
In response, the Secretary General is essentially begging the international community for a massive $500 billion annual SDG stimulus package. The core argument being made is that the global financial system institutions like the IMF and World Bank is fundamentally failing developing nations.
How so?
These poorer nations are currently drowning in exorbitant debt servicing costs, meaning they're paying more to Western banks in interest than they are spending on healthcare and education for their own citizens. It makes the achievement of the SDGs mathematically impossible.
And then you have climate change, arguably the ultimate transnational threat that doesn't respect any borders. The UN is the sole arena for the massive global climate negotiations, the COP process.
Right.
Let's look at the mechanics of COP29, which was held in Baku, Azerbaijan in late 2024. They branded it the Finance COP.
They called it that because the entire overarching goal of the summit was to figure out a mechanism to actually pay for the astronomical costs of climate adaptation and green energy transition in the developing world.
And how did that go?
The final outcome was, predictably, highly contentious. The developed countries, the ones historically responsible for the majority of emissions, agreed to a framework to provide $300 billion annually by 2035 to developing nations.
Which, to an average person, sounds like an unfathomable amount of money, until you hear the other number required by the physics of the problem.
Exactly. Developing nations protested the final agreement fiercely, citing peer-reviewed economic research showing that they actually need an estimated $1.3 trillion annually to survive the coming impacts.
So the gap between the diplomatic pledge and the physical reality is enormous.
It's a massive shortfall. However, there was a highly significant, highly technical breakthrough at COP29 regarding Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. They finally established the complex legal framework for a UN-managed, centralized global carbon credit market.
I really want to break down the HOW of this because carbon markets always sound like financial jargon. How does a UN carbon market actually work mechanically?
At its core, it is an attempt to use the mechanics of global capitalism to force overall emissions down. Imagine a highly polluting steel mill in Germany that cannot easily reduce its emissions today.
Okay.
Under Article 6, that German company can purchase UN-certified carbon credits. The money from that purchase goes directly to fund a project that reduces emissions elsewhere, say, building a massive new wind farm in Kenya, or protecting a specific swath of the Amazon rainforest from logging.
So it's an offsetting mechanism.
Yeah.
The German pollution is offset by the Kenyan clean energy, and the UN acts as the auditor to make sure the math is real. Meaning it's a high-integrity, heavily regulated system, rather than the Wild West of private, unregulated, voluntary carbon markets we've seen recently, where companies were buying junk credits for forests that were never actually in danger.
Precisely. The UN mechanism establishes rigorous methodologies to ensure that 1 ton of carbon purchased actually equals 1 ton of carbon removed or avoided permanently.
Moving to the global health front, the source outlines how, following the deep trauma of COVID-19, the WHO has been furiously negotiating a legally binding pandemic agreement slated for May 2025.
The structural goal of this treaty is to establish binding principles for vaccine equity and supply chain logistics so we do not repeat the vaccine apartheid of 2021.
Where wealthy nations hoarded billions of doses while healthcare workers in developing nations died unprotected.
Exactly. Crucially, it also legally obligates member countries to share genomic data rapidly on new emerging pathogens rather than hiding outbreaks for fear of economic consequences.
But the mechanics of actually passing this treaty have been absolutely hammered by massive, coordinated disinformation campaigns. Right?
This raises an incredibly important question about how viral domestic politics now actively undermine international treaties. Throughout 2024, there were rampant, globally coordinated false claims circulating on social media that this treaty would somehow cede national sovereignty directly to the WHO.
I saw some of those viral posts claiming that bureaucrats in Geneva could somehow mandate local lockdowns in your town or force mandatory medical treatments on citizens.
The disinformation was so potent that the drafters of the final text had to explicitly clarify, multiple times in the legal language, that sovereign control over domestic health policy remains entirely with the member states. The WHO simply does not have the mechanism or the authority to lock down a town in Ohio or a city in France.
It's honestly amazing how much institutional energy has to be spent just fighting ghosts on the internet.
It's exhausting.
And speaking of institutional energy, the UN is expected to do all of this. Fix the SDGs, regulate global carbon markets, stop the next pandemic, deliver food to Gaza while being completely, utterly broke.
The liquidity crisis.
The source material outlines a severe, crippling liquidity crisis. We mentioned earlier that the UN has no taxes. It relies on member states paying their assessed mandatory dues. And the United States, which is the largest contributor, responsible for 22% of the regular UN budget, is often incredibly late paying its bills due to its own domestic partisan political dysfunction in Congress.
And when the largest payer is late, it creates a devastating ripple effect across the entire machine. When the UN is structurally short on cash, they have to institute drastic measures. They mandate hiring freezes across agencies, they limit critical travel for human rights investigators.
And what's the worst part?
Most critically and most painfully, they delay the financial reimbursements to the troop-contributing countries for peacekeeping missions.
Okay, stop right there. Let me play this out, because what does this actually mean in practice? Think about the profound moral hazard this creates.
It's incredibly bleak.
You have incredibly wealthy nations like the US, the UK, France, sitting in comfortable air-conditioned chambers in New York, vigorously debating policy and actively authorizing dangerous peacekeeping missions in places like the Congo.
Yeah.
Then, developing countries like Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Nepal, who supply the vast majority of the actual infantry, send their young soldiers into these incredibly dangerous war zones wearing the blue helmets. They bleed, they risk their lives to enforce the mandate designed by the rich countries.
Yes.
And then, the wealthy countries fail to pay their mandatory dues, causing a liquidity crisis, which means the UN cannot pay the poor countries back on time for the sacrifice of their soldiers. It is a stunning, deeply offensive inequity.
It is arguably one of the most glaring systemic injustices embedded in the UN's daily operational model. The Global South bears the physical risk, while the Global North controls the purse strings and often fails to pull them.
Just wow.
And this exact frustration is driving a massive demand from the global majority for structural reform, which culminated in the massive summit that produced the 2024 Pact for the Future.
The Pact for the Future. This was heavily billed as a massive reboot of the entire multilateral system. Did it actually change the software?
It was a very ambitious attempt to address the glaring gaps in 21st century global governance. It includes commitments to structurally reform the global financial architecture, giving developing nations a significantly louder voice and better voting weight in the IMF and World Bank.
That's a big deal.
It includes a global digital compact designed to bridge the global digital divide and establish baseline international principles for artificial intelligence governance before the technology completely outpaces regulation.
And there was something about future generations too, right?
Fascinatingly, from a legal perspective, it includes the first ever formal declaration explicitly committing the UN to account for the interests of future generations in today's policymaking, essentially trying to bake long-termism into international law.
Alongside these grand declarations, there are also internal procedural reforms happening that are super interesting, like the veto initiative.
Yes, the veto initiative.
They obviously cannot force the P5 to give up their veto power, as we discussed. That would break the machine. But they changed the procedural rules. so that any time a veto is cast in the Security Council, it automatically triggers a mandatory debate in the General Assembly within 10 days.
It is a brilliant mechanism of political accountability. It doesn't legally overturn the veto, but it drastically raises the political cost of obstruction.
Yeah.
It forces the vetoing superpower to physically stand on the podium on the world stage, look the rest of the planet in the eye, and publicly justify why they blocked inaction to stop a war.
Now, before we synthesize all of this, there's one other structural shift mentioned deeply in the source material that I found genuinely alarming. It's the debate over what they call the fourth pillar of the UN.
Ah, yes.
We traditionally know the three main pillars: peace and security, human rights, and development. But the source notes that since the September 11th attacks, counterterrorism has essentially metastasized into a massive, heavily funded de facto fourth pillar.
Yes, and this evolution raises an incredibly important question about how the UN's structural legitimacy can be manipulated. Since 2001, massive, well-funded bureaucratic structures, like the UN Office of Counterterrorism, have emerged and grown rapidly.
But there's a loophole.
Human rights critics detailed in the source report point out a very dangerous systemic loophole. They argue this intense, unquestioned focus on security allows authoritarian or highly abusive states to actively engage in what they call blue washing.
Blue washing. I've heard greenwashing for fake environmentalism, but blue washing for the UN.
Yeah.
How does that mechanism work?
It's a mechanism of narrative control. An authoritarian state can enact brutally violent internal crackdowns against legitimate political dissidents, journalists, or ethnic minorities. But instead of facing international condemnation for human rights abuses, the state categorizes these dissidents as terrorists. They then legitimize their violent actions on the global stage by actively participating in UN counterterrorism conferences, adopting UN counterterrorism language, and framing their internal suppression as UN-sanctioned compliance.
That's horrifying.
It actively diverts UN focus and resources entirely away from human rights and provides a globally respected shield for horrific state violence.
Wow. It's the machinery of the UN being actively used to provide cover for the exact abuses the UN was founded to prevent.
Exactly.
Which really brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. We've looked at the ashes of the League of Nations, the sprawling anatomy of organs and agencies, the triumphs and the traumas of the Blue Helmets, the paralysis over Ukraine and Gaza, and the empty wallets facing the polycrisis.
We've covered a lot of ground.
And what emerges from all of this information is the profound concept of the necessary flaw.
It is the defining paradox of our era. The United Nations is routinely, painfully, politically paralyzed in the Security Council whenever the interests of the great powers directly clash. Yet, simultaneously, it remains the absolute, unquestionable, and only lifeline for millions of innocent victims of those very same clashes. It is chronically, embarrassingly underfunded, its peacekeeping model is facing an existential crisis of consent, and yet, member states continually heap massive new, complex mandates onto its plate, demanding it regulate artificial intelligence, manage global carbon markets, and cure the next pandemic.
It is the hopelessly broken toaster that also somehow performs vital, life-saving heart surgery every single day. The history we've discussed shows us that the UN does not evolve through proactive, visionary, utopian design. It evolves entirely through reactive trauma.
Exactly.
The League of Nations died because its architecture was too rigid, it demanded perfection and unanimity, and is shattered. The United Nations has survived for 8 decades, precisely because it is deeply flawed, because it accommodates the ugly realism of power, and because it can bend and adapt and invent things like peacekeeping out of thin air, even if it does so agonizingly slowly.
There is a famous, heavily quoted observation from Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, that perfectly, elegantly encapsulates this entire structural reality. He said, "The United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell."
To save humanity from hell. The learner, I want you to really internalize that thought. The UN is not a magical fix-all. It isn't some benevolent alien supercomputer sitting in New York dispensing perfect, objective justice to the world.
It's just us.
It is simply a mirror. It is a reflection of our collective geopolitical will, our deepest fears, our greed, and our highest hopes. When the UN fails to stop a genocide or fails to halt climate change, it isn't the glass building in New York that failed. It is we, the global community of sovereign nations, who have actively failed to find the political courage and the resources to act.
The machine is exactly as effective and exactly as moral as its member states allow it to be.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Building on this core idea of the UN as the world's underlying software, we've spent the last hour detailing how geopolitical fractures are rapidly deepening between the Western democratic powers and the increasingly aligned Russia-China bloc.
The divides are getting deeper.
We've seen the absolute gridlock of the Security Council. We've seen the weaponization of funding. So what happens if, in the near future, a rising superpower or a massive coalition of powerful states in the global south simply decides they are permanently done dealing with the structural bugs and the Western biases embedded in this 1945 software?
What if they just walk away?
What if they stop trying to incrementally reform the UN from the inside and instead decide to build a massive, parallel, heavily funded rival operating system, a completely separate architecture for international law, global trade, development loans, and security standards?
You are describing the total fracture of the post-WWII consensus, a completely bifurcated global order.
Exactly. Imagine a world where the UN is no longer the only game in town. How would you, as a global citizen or a business leader, navigate a world with two completely competing sets of international rules of the road?
Which human rights court do you listen to?
Which carbon market do you use? It's a deeply daunting thought, but as we accelerate into a truly multipolar world, the emergence of a rival global operating system might be the next ultimate stress test for humanity.
It's something we all need to prepare for.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, The Learner. Never stop questioning the machine, never accept the headlines at face value, and never stop looking under the hood of the incredibly complex world around you. We'll see you next time.